I stared at the splintered wreckage in front of me, the remains of my grandfather's cabin, now reduced to a jagged heap of cedar, glass, and dirt. The porch swing where we'd eaten watermelon on summer nights, gone. The handmade window shutters he carved with his initials, scattered like broken bones across the gravel. And standing next to it all, looking like she'd just won the neighborhood lottery, was Lenora Prescott, chairwoman of the Willow Glen HOA and destroyer of everything I thought was untouchable. She said it was just an unpermitted structure, said it made the community look like a backwoods campground. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that she had just bulldozed a site protected under state law. And worse, she thought she'd gotten away with it, thought I'd shrug and walk off with my memories in a box like an evicted tenant. But this wasn't just a pile of lumber. This was my grandfather's legacy, one that stretched back 70 years. And while Lenora stood there smug in her leopard print heels, she didn't realize she'd just kicked off a war that would take her title, her power, and possibly her freedom. Comment below if you've ever met someone like this, someone who hides behind policy to justify a crime. Because today was supposed to be peaceful, but peace ended the moment I saw that bulldozer parked like it owned the land. The drive back to Willow Glen should have been peaceful. After 6 months working at the city library, I was looking forward to spending a quiet weekend at the cabin where I'd grown up visiting my grandfather every summer. Graham Easton Sr. had built that place back in 1952, back when this area was still considered the outskirts of town. Every board, every nail, every window frame had been placed by his weathered hand. The cabin wasn't just a building to me. She called it beautification. I called it erasure, and I was still standing there, clutching a fragment of what used to be our front porch, when she strutted up and said, "You're welcome." That shack was bringing the whole community down. She might as well have slapped me with a flagpole. I told her she had no right. She pulled out a folder, thick-tabbed and reeking of toner, and claimed it was all by the book. I didn't bother flipping through it. I've seen better fiction in middle school book reports. According to her, the HOA had sent multiple warnings about visual violations and non-compliant exterior finishes. According to my mailbox, I'd received exactly 0. Her logic was like a termite's: eat through everything and then act surprised when the whole house collapses. That's the thing about power trips. They make people forget altitude comes with consequences. On the drive home, the silence felt loud. I wasn't grieving. This wasn't sadness, it was surgical focus. I remembered something Pop used to say: "Let 'em get bold, son. Bold gets sloppy, and sloppy leaves fingerprints." So I started digging. First stop, the steel filing cabinet in my grandfather's old workshop. Pop had the record-keeping habits of a paranoid librarian. Everything was labeled, cross-referenced, dated, and signed, and that's when I found it. Tucked behind tax assessments and hand-drawn floor plans, a yellow envelope stamped with a seal from the State Preservation Office, and a certificate inside, protected historical structure, designation confirmed. The cabin wasn't just meaningful to us, it was legally protected by the state. Which meant Lenora Prescott hadn't just overstepped her authority, she'd committed a felony. And the best part? She did it proudly, loudly, publicly. I called Douglas Hart, the kind of real estate lawyer who knows how to kill with kindness and footnotes. We met years ago when I ran archival grants for the library. I told him what happened. He let out a whistle and said, "If that certificate holds up, she just bought herself an indictment." That was all I needed to hear. The war had officially started, and this time I wasn't bringing a complaint. I was bringing the full weight of the law. I spent the evening scanning documents, snapping photos, lining up timelines like a prosecutor prepping an opening statement. Meanwhile, across the street, Lenora's lights stayed on. Her silhouette passed the window, phone in hand, probably calling a contractor for the next project she didn't have the right to approve. She thought she was untouchable. She thought I was passive. But here's the thing about quiet men. We don't shout, we file. She thought it was just a teardown. I knew it was a trigger. The kind of thing that doesn't end in court, it ends in a courtroom documentary. The last time someone underestimated my family's paperwork, they got audited into retirement. And here she was, grinning like she'd discovered fire while standing on top of ashes that would become evidence. See? My grandfather didn't just build cabins. He built insurance cases. Every nail in that house came with a receipt, a date, and probably a notarized witness. I grew up learning that preparation beats noise every time. Lenora brought a bulldozer to a legal knife fight. She was about to find out what happens when the guy who used to write library grant policies finds out you violated 7 state ordinances and buried a civil rights site under HOA mulch. And you can bet your last landscaping fine. I was just getting warmed up. I opened the metal drawer, expecting dust and disappointment. What I found was an archive that would put the Library of Congress to shame. Every folder my grandfather ever touched was there, tabbed, dated, and obsessively neat. It was like he'd been training for a bureaucratic apocalypse. Maintenance logs, letters from the utility board, even a receipt for the cedar oil he used on the porch posts every fall. It felt like he'd whispered from the grave. They'll come for this one day. Be ready. And right there, nestled in a tan folder labeled Heritage Studies. Confidential. I found my first grenade. That's the moment I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a hit job. And she was about to learn what happens when you try to erase a man who filed like a historian and fought like a lawyer. Lenora, of course, was still putting on her HOA Broadway performance. She came strutting down my driveway the next day, swinging that same overstuffed folder like it was the Constitution, claimed she'd sent me 5 notices via certified mail, all conveniently unreturned, said I'd ignored every last one of them, which, in her mind, gave her unconventional authority to greenlight demolition. I asked if she could show me even one receipt. Her smile got tighter than a Botox party. She flipped through a few pages, pointed at a barcode, and said, "There, see?" I leaned in, looked real close, and said, "That's the tracking number for a pizza coupon." Her face turned the same shade as her lipstick. "And that folder?" It suddenly looked like the world's worst defense exhibit. The thing about liars, they always think confidence can replace proof. Back inside, I kept digging. Grandpa had included everything: correspondence with the State Preservation Office, inspection reports from the 90S, and a notarized application for historic designation that looked like it had been handled with gloves. His handwriting was stiff but steady. He wrote with the care of a man who knew every word might someday be read aloud in a courtroom. He hadn't just applied for recognition, he'd made the case himself. He documented how his brother, Elijah Benton, had used the cabin to host community meetings and teacher trainings during the early years of school integration. There were pictures, grainy but powerful, of black and white educators shaking hands on the front porch. Every nail in that cabin held up history. And now, the woman with a rhinestone HOA badge had bulldozed it with all the grace of a wrecking ball, in heels. The deeper I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about me anymore. I scanned everything, multiple copies, uploaded them to 3 different cloud accounts. If Lenora thought she could bluff her way through this, she was going to be the queen of an HOA built on quicksand. And the best part? She didn't even know what she'd stepped into yet. But I had a hunch she was getting nervous. That afternoon, a car with out-of-state plates parked across from my house for over an hour. A man inside, sunglasses, reading a book that never turned a page. Surveillance? Amateurish, but still a step up from certified pizza coupons. She was poking the hornet's nest now. And trust me, my family might have been quiet, but we kept our stingers sharp and our paper trails sharp enough to paper-cut your name into the court docket. I ended the night with a call to Victor Meeks, the city archivist and the only man alive who loved footnotes more than my grandfather. I asked if he could pull any record of community historic designations from the 90S. He didn't even ask why. "If it's on file, I'll find it," he said. That's when I remembered something Pop told me once, long before I ever imagined I'd be fighting a leopard print tyrant with a legal license. People like her, son, they confuse authority with power. One is appointed, the other's earned. And just like that, I knew I had the thread. All I had to do now was pull. The next morning, I walked 2 blocks over to the house with the yellow roses and the wind chimes that sounded like old jazz records. Mrs. Bertie Holloway had lived in Willow Glen longer than any of the sidewalks. Her memory was like concrete cured in sunlight, firm, warm, and full of cracks that told stories if you looked close enough. She was sitting on her porch wearing her usual floral apron, shelling peas like truth came wrapped in pods. I didn't even have to say a word. "You hear about that cabin, aren't you?" she asked, nodding before I could speak. "Come on up, baby. You're going to want to sit down for this one. When Bertie tells you to sit, you sit. Even judges would take off their robes." She poured sweet tea into mason jars that had probably seen more summers than I had, then pulled out a photo album with a spine more bent than an HOA rulebook. "Your Uncle Caleb," she began, "wasn't just a teacher. He was a builder of people. That cabin, it wasn't just wood and windows, it was sanctuary." She opened the album. There he was, my great-uncle Caleb Benton, standing on the porch of the cabin with a half-dozen young black teachers, arms around each other, notebooks in hand, the 1950s version of radical optimism. They held planning meetings there, curriculum swaps, quiet strategy sessions. The school board wouldn't give 'em space, so your grandpa gave 'em wood and a roof. I looked at those faces, hopeful, determined, tired, and suddenly the pile of splinters in my yard felt like a crime scene. Bertie turned the page and tapped a photo. "This one here? This is the day they found out they'd be allowed to teach in the new integrated school system. Your uncle cried. Didn't even wipe his face, just said, 'Let's get to work.'" Her voice caught for a moment, and I realized I was holding my breath like it might turn into evidence. "You see why that place mattered now?" she said. "Lenora didn't tear down a shed, Graham. She erased a page from this county's soul." That hit me hard. We talk about progress like it's paved, but sometimes it's just built out of timber and courage and people who don't back down. I asked her if anyone from the state ever came out to document the site. She nodded, slow and sure. "Back in '98. State preservation folks. They measured, photographed, even interviewed me. Said the cabin was one of the last informal black educational sites still standing. Told me it might qualify for landmark protection." My jaw tensed. This lined up with what I'd already found in Pop's file box. Bertie hadn't just confirmed the story, she'd lived inside it. "And what did they do with that information?" I asked. She shrugged. "Not much. Sent a letter. Said they'd follow up. I guess nobody thought they'd have to fight for it again." She looked me in the eye. "Guess that's your job now, baby." On the walk home, I passed where the cabin had stood. Just earth now, flat and raw. It looked like a grave that hadn't settled. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't just angry. I was on a mission. This wasn't about restitution anymore. It was about restoration. Lenora Prescott hadn't just knocked down a cabin. She'd bulldozed a civil rights monument with a smile on her face and a checklist in her hand. But what she didn't know, what she could never understand, is that you can't demolish legacy with machinery. It always finds a way to stand again. Back in the basement, I searched like a man chasing last chances. The dust was thick enough to file a claim, and every box was a cardboard tombstone for some forgotten piece of our lives. That's when I saw it. An old tin container tucked behind Pop's workbench, red-brown with rust, and a label so plain it almost felt sacred. "Open when it matters most." My hands didn't tremble. They locked around that box like it was a steering wheel, and I was taking back the wheel of this entire mess. Inside was a neatly tied stack of papers, sealed in a Ziploc bag like Pop knew moisture and history don't mix. I read the top page. Then I read it again. State of Tennessee, Department of Cultural Preservation, Landmark Certification. My grandfather's cabin had been a protected historic site since 1999. Lenora hadn't just knocked down a house. She'd stepped on a landmine wrapped in law. I scanned every document, high-res, multiple angles, backed them up to 2 drives in a cloud folder. You don't hold evidence like that. You preserve it like an endangered species. The language was clear. This property shall not be altered, removed, or demolished without written approval from the State Preservation Board. Well, guess what wasn't filed? Anything remotely resembling permission. Lenora's little HOA empire had just detonated its own front porch. And me? I was done being polite. I sent an email that afternoon to a name I'd kept in my back pocket for years. Victor Meeks, real estate attorney, preservation specialist, and a man who enjoyed laws the way other people enjoy barbecue. I didn't just ask for help. I gave him the match and pointed to the gasoline. Victor called me back before I'd even finished pouring coffee. His voice was calm, but the kind of calm you hear right before the prosecution plays the tape. "Graham," he said, "this isn't just a civil issue. It's a criminal one. What she did violates Title 4, Chapter 14 of the State Heritage Code. That's felony territory, up to 5 years and 50 grand in fines, not counting restitution." My eyebrows nearly hit the ceiling. I asked if he was sure. He just chuckled. "Let me put it this way. If this were a chess match, she just moved her queen into check with her own bishop. And you've got the board memorized." I sat back and let that land, because for the first time in this fight, the ground had shifted under her leopard print heels. We agreed to meet at his office the next morning. I packed the tin box like it was national treasure, drove with both hands. No radio, no stops. When I arrived, Victor was already waiting, with a legal pad the size of a road map and an expression like Christmas came early. He reviewed the documents silently, flipping pages, occasionally muttering things like, "Oh, that's bad," and "She's cooked." Finally, he closed the folder, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "If she's smart, she'll settle. If she's stupid, she'll speak." And knowing Lenora, she'd probably organize a press conference and declare herself queen of civic improvement. Either way, the balance had shifted. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was loading the cannon. That night, I sat at my dining room table surrounded by evidence, printouts, legal precedents, and Victor's notes. It felt like prepping for trial, and maybe it was. But the strangest thing? I wasn't nervous. I felt like every step, every document Pop saved, every memory Birdie handed me, had led to this. Lenora Prescott thought she'd demolished a reckoning and had just found the receipt for it, notarized and legally binding. What she didn't know yet was that her kingdom of bylaws had one fatal flaw. It was built on someone else's foundation, and I held the deed, the code, and now the match. Next stop, watching her try to talk her way out of an arrest warrant. The community center looked like it was prepped for a bake sale and a political coup, folding chairs in neat rows, lemonade pitchers sweating on plastic tables. But make no mistake, this wasn't an HOA meeting. This was a showdown dressed in polyester and passive aggression. Lenora Prescott arrived 15 minutes late, like a CO coming to fire her own board. Red blazer so loud it needed its own zip code, clipboard tucked like a scepter. She marched to the front like Moses parting the red tape and said, "Let's bring some order to the rumors." She'd wait for permission. Just launched into a speech so rehearsed it had costume changes. "This individual," she gestured toward me like I was a raccoon loose in the produce aisle, "has manufactured an entire fantasy to slander this community's leadership. The documents he's presented are, at best, forgeries, and at worst, part of a larger attempt to defraud homeowners." She paused for effect. Not a single neighbor clapped. She might have expected applause. What she got was coughs and quiet side eyes. Then, like a plot twist in a courtroom drama, Birdie Holloway stood. No gavel, no theatrics, just the authority of truth wrapped in orthopedic shoes. I watched Caleb Benton teach in that cabin. I watched the state declare it historic. I watched this woman lie through lipstick. The words landed like bricks. Someone dropped their lemonade. She kept going, smooth and steady. It wasn't just a cabin. It was a schoolhouse, a civil rights shelter, a place where integration took its first baby steps in this county, and she flattened it like it was a roach. Others stood too, not in protest, in testimony. Rajiv Patel, retired Air Force. I asked Lenora to see the budget last year. She told me to mind my own lawn. Then came Denise, a nurse, who said she'd seen Lenora intercepting mailboxes with rubber gloves. Then Carl, who worked night shifts, and said he'd heard demolition trucks roll in at dawn without warning. She said it was an emergency beautification effort, he muttered. Didn't know that meant erasing history. The room shifted. Not loud, not chaotic, but decisive. Like the whole neighborhood had woken up from a long, HOA-induced nap. And then the door opened, and the voice we all didn't know we were waiting for finally spoke. "My name is Frank Doyle, State Preservation Office." A man in a gray blazer, holding a binder that looked like it weighed more than HOA regulations. "Miss Prescott," he continued, calm as a surgeon, "you are currently the subject of an ongoing investigation regarding the unlawful destruction of state-protected property." You could hear Lenora's pearls tighten. "We have recordings of conversations between you and contractors instructing them to proceed despite warning signs." Frank set the binder on the table and clicked open a recording. Lenora's voice, clear as day. "I don't care what plaques are on the wall. That shack comes down by noon." A collective gasp. One neighbor stood, then another, then half the room, not yelling, just rising. Lenora looked around like someone realizing the fire drill wasn't a drill. "This is all being taken out of context," she snapped, voice cracking. "Except manipulated those files. I'm the one protecting this community." But her words bounced off walls like wet noodles. Frank raised a hand. "Ms. Prescott, you may remain silent. I suggest you do." He turned to me. "Mr. Benton, thank you for your cooperation. We'll be filing an injunction against any further HOA activity pending legal review." I nodded, suddenly aware I was gripping my chair like it might run off, and as Lenora stood frozen, her folder limp in her hands, I saw something rare. Not guilt, not fear, just the hollow surprise of someone who truly believed they were untouchable until the law tapped them on the shoulder. We left the community center in stunned silence, neighbors shaking hands like we'd all survived a storm together. Bertie squeezed my shoulder. "Sometimes," she whispered, "you don't have to shout to win. You just have to show up with truth." That night I sat on my porch alone, the first quiet moment in weeks. Above me, stars. Behind me, wreckage. But inside me, a storm had settled. And for the first time since this war began, I didn't feel like a man defending. I felt like a builder standing on the edge of foundation stones, ready to rise. They say history repeats itself, but sometimes it just prosecutes. Within 3 weeks, Lenora Prescott's red blazer was swapped for a Department of Corrections jumpsuit. Turns out, the woman who claimed to protect property values had actually been part of a multi-state scam targeting historic sites. She'd done this before. Bulldozed the past, then broker shady deals for future developments. The only problem? This time, she picked the wrong pile of lumber to lie about. She thought she was demolishing a shed. She ended up detonating her entire empire. The trial was swift, not because the system moved fast, but because the evidence was heavier than guilt on Sunday morning. Frank Doyle and his team produced everything, from demolition invoices to voice recordings to financial statements tracing kickbacks through shell companies that sounded like rejected startup names. The court didn't just convict Lenora, it exposed the network. 14 indictments, 6 states, over $4 million in fraudulent development contracts. She didn't just get disbarred from HOA leadership, she got banned from stepping foot in historic districts for life. Watching her sentencing was like watching a circus fold its tent in reverse. The woman who once threatened to fine me for my porch light being a bit too blue now faced 15 years for conspiracy and property destruction. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just stared ahead like the script had gone off book and the understudy wasn't showing up. The judge called her actions arrogant, calculated, and corrosive to the public trust. Somewhere in the back, Bertie whispered, "Told you that pin was cursed." The cabin's reconstruction took 9 months, not because of delay, but because we did it right. Every beam, every nail, sourced and restored to 1950 S standard. Local craftsmen, volunteers, and preservation specialists worked together like they were rebuilding more than wood. And they were. They were rebuilding dignity. And when it was done, it didn't just look like the old cabin. It felt like it. Like memory had muscle. We mounted a bronze plaque by the door. It read, "The Caleb Benton Heritage Site," in honor of a teacher who turned shelter into change. The dedication day felt like a chapter closing on something much larger than property law. Over 300 people came, including teachers, former students, civil rights leaders, and yes, even some of the folks who once voted for Lenora's tree trimming budget. There were tears, laughter, gospel singing, and homemade cobbler that could have caused a diplomatic incident. And when I stood on that porch, in the shadow of my grandfather's vision and my uncle's courage, I didn't speak like a victim or even a hero. I just said what felt true. Some people try to erase the past with bulldozers, but history doesn't scare easy. Somewhere between the fresh paint and the old memories, I found peace. Not the kind that avoids conflict, but the kind that follows a fight well fought. The neighborhood found it too. Meetings got quieter, smiles stuck longer, people waved again without suspicion. And the HOA? Reformed, transparent, chaired by a team of volunteers who understood that leadership isn't about enforcement. It's about stewardship. Lenora's name disappeared from the minutes and reappeared only as a cautionary tale. Don't elect a queen when you need a neighbor. And me? I still visit the cabin, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with kids from the local school who come to learn about Caleb, about what can be built with bare hands and bold ideas, about what should never be torn down just to polish up a spreadsheet. One of those kids asked me once, "What would you say to the woman who tried to erase all this?" I smiled. "I'd thank her," I said. "She tried to bulldoze history, but all she did was prove it mattered." Because here's the truth. You can move dirt, bend bylaws, even rewrite agendas, but you can't erase roots when the soil remembers. The story doesn't end with a court date or a ribbon cutting. It ends right here, on a porch rebuilt, on land re-honored, in a community redeemed. It ends with people remembering not just what was lost, but why it had to be saved. And if you've ever faced someone who thought they were too powerful to be questioned, remember this. Truth may take its time, but it never shows up empty-handed. And me? I'm still just a man, with a coffee cup and a memory, still sitting on a porch that nearly got erased, watching history breathe again. Only now, when I look out, I don't just see trees and rooftops. I see a neighborhood that woke up. I see a past that refused to stay buried. And I see a future where no one bulldozes truth to plant a lie. See, this wasn't just a story about me, or my uncle, or a crooked HOA queen in a red blazer. This was about what happens when regular folks, quiet folks, decide they've had enough of being steamrolled. It's about how legacy can outlive greed, how dignity can be rebuilt board by board, and how justice doesn't always knock loud, but it always knocks. So if you ever find yourself facing a clipboard dictator or watching someone erase what matters under the name of progress, remember, you don't need a badge to stand your ground. You just need proof, purpose, and a little bit of porch grit. Now, if this story moved you, if it reminded you that truth still has teeth and communities still have heart, do me a favor, leave a comment, let me know where you're listening from, and if your neighborhood's ever had its own HOA horror story. Smash that like button so more folks hear stories that fight back, and subscribe to the channel because next week we're diving into a story with more twists than a garden hose in July. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Because here at this channel, we don't just tell stories, we restore what matters.